Young Sherlock Holmes movie review. So this is a trip back into 1980s nostalgia. For me, kind of movie nostalgia is from the 1980s. I was a child in the 1980s. It is divided into kind of maybe two categories. One is movies I saw, which I have a great nostalgia for. And the other is movies actually that I didn't see. I wasn't allowed to see, but I was aware of. You know, like people were talking about it at school. You could see like the advertisements on TV. You could see the movie posters. And so like it had an impact on the culture. And so even though I never saw them, the idea of these movies has a certain nostalgic appeal to me. I suspect we all have movies like that from whatever era we grew up in. Anyways, there were a number of actually children's movies in the 80s that I was not allowed to see. And I think this was kind of unique to this time. They've kind of maybe stopped making so much of these movies so much, but kind of movies that had kids in them, but had some kind of scary elements to it or some sort of adult themes to it. I mean, Goonies was maybe another example from the same era. Another movie that I was not allowed to see at the time, although I've made up for lost time since, and I've since seen that movie many times since I got a bit older. But yeah, you know, I remember this movie was deemed not appropriate for children. I had a babysitter who saw it, and she said, "Oh yeah, I saw it. Definitely don't bring your kids to it." She said to my mother, and she said to us, "Yeah, it's not appropriate to children." Friends I know who have seen it, people who are the same age as me, who actually saw it when they were kids, a lot of them have some sort of traumatic memory of some of the more frightening scenes in this movie. Which, actually I say traumatic, but like, it's almost, well, how do you put this into words, huh? You know, when you see something kind of scary as a child, it's almost like a nostalgic memory. You're like, yes, I remember how much that used to scare me as a child. You know, kind of like a good feeling being scared. Or I don't know. Anyways, I was reminiscing about childhood movies, and I saw this movie in the video store, and I thought, yes, I'm finally going to watch this. So, on to reviewing the movie. In this movie, Sherlock Holmes, it's about a young Sherlock Holmes, and also a young Dr. Watson. Sorry, he's not a doctor at this point. A young Watson. So they meet for the first time when they're boys. Now, this is a departure from the novels, or from Arthur Conan Doyle's stories. Because in Arthur Conan Doyle's stories, they're introduced to each other for the first time as adults. In fact, in the very first story kind of covers their meeting, which I think was A Study in Scarlet, if I'm remembering right. That was the very first story. So that's a big continuity glitch between this movie and the original stories. But I think if you can ignore that, or as they call it nowadays, I think, retcon that, then everything else lines up pretty well. Not only does the movie, everything else in the movie work with Sherlock Holmes' continuity, but it also explains a lot of things that Conan Doyle never got around to explaining, such as the origin of Holmes' distinctive deerstalker cap, coat, and pipe, the beginning of Sherlock Holmes' relationship with Inspector Lestrade, the origins of Moriarty, and his rivalry with Holmes, and the reason why Holmes has maintained a distance from women all his adult life. Actually, it turns out, spoilers, the reason that Holmes has maintained a distance from women all his adult life is because of the death of his first true love, which I think is actually the same reason that Ian Fleming gave for James Bond. Inability to form a relationship is kind of the death of his first true love. Which I should make the disclaimer here. I've never actually read the original James Bond movies. I'm only familiar with it from the movies. But you know, that's the reason given in the movies, right? Is that the James Bond's wife was killed, and so he was never able to form an attachment to any other women. Yeah, which is arguably kind of ripping off James Bond. But, you know, maybe it's all fair game, because Ian Fleming, I think, was inspired by by the Fu Manchu series. The Fu Manchu series were inspired by Sherlock Holmes, so, you know, everything's inspired by everything else. Speaking of which, actually, talking about inspiration, the young Sherlock Holmes movie is obviously drawing a lot of inspiration from Indiana Jones. They could almost have called this young Indiana Jones. In particular, it seems to be drawing a lot of inspiration from Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, which, if you go check the dates, I think Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom came out like the year before this did. So there's an Egyptian cult of the dead, there's an underground temple, there's a human sacrifice scene which seems very similar to Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, with a lot of chanting and the young heroes kind of looking on horrified from their hiding place. So, yeah, I think, I don't know actually the history of this. I think the Temple of Doom came out maybe 1 year before this did, which I don't know at that point if this movie was already in pre-production and some of that was a coincidence, or maybe 1 year is kind of enough time for the Hollywood production to completely copy everything. I don't know. Again though, Indiana Jones is kind of inspired in part by some of these adventure serials, which were inspired by Fu Manchu, which was inspired by Sherlock Holmes. So everybody just kind of rips off everybody. And maybe it's all fair game. I'm going to move on to the flaws of the film. I've read some internet reviews which kind of criticize this movie because Holmes and Watson kind of more or less stumble onto the bad guys, into the bad guys' plot, instead of kind of Holmes using his famous deductive reasoning. I'm going to give that a pass though, because I was just reading recently the Sherlock Holmes stories by Arthur Conan Doyle, and actually in a fair amount of these stories, Holmes and Watson actually just kind of stumble on to the bad guys, or kind of stumble on to the mystery. So I'm not sure that's entirely incongruous with the original stories. I'm not going to hold that against the film. Also in the movie, just like in Conan Doyle's stories, Holmes is not sharing with Watson all the information that he has. Only when you get to the end of the case does Holmes kind of show all the information that he's been accumulating all this time. But again, that's just like the original novels or the original Arthur Conan Doyle stories. What is different in this movie, and what's a bit unfortunate, is that the movie viewer has more information than either Holmes or Watson. Because the movie viewer sees the assassinations earlier in the film. So that to me kind of takes away all the suspense out of it. I mean, I understand that in these stories, it's common for Holmes not to share all the information he has with Watson. But never in the original Sherlock Holmes stories does the reader ever at any point have more information than Holmes and Watson. Because, you know, the stories are all told from Dr. Watson's point of view. Almost all of them. Also, the victims are shot with a poison dart, which causes them to hallucinate. And here's where kind of all these kind of scary scenes came up that kind of made such a big impression on my friends who saw this as children. It's also where kind of some of the special effects are being kind of shown off in this film. But, I don't know, watching it now as an adult, the hallucination scenes are just boring and, well, boring because you know when you're watching it that this is just an hallucination scene. You know it's not real. So it is kind of an excuse for them to show off a lot of their great special effects, great for the time, but it doesn't advance the story at all, and you're just like, why am I watching this? I know this isn't real. And it goes on too long, and it's just weird dream sequences. I don't know, I didn't like it. Well, I'm complaining about other things. None of the action scenes are choreographed with any sense of suspense. And none of the physical action in this movie seems to make a lot of sense. For example, there's one point where the heroine is abducted by the bad guys. And they just kind of grab her wrist and run away with her. And she just kind of runs with them. She doesn't seem to be making any effort to resist them at all. And that just kind of took me out of the movie a little bit. There's another part where the bad guys have these swords and they're trying to hit Holmes and Watson. But it's just so lazy. They're just swinging these swords so slowly and clumsily, and it doesn't seem real. Like, it doesn't seem to be any real effort to hit them. It just kind of seems like these very slowly choreographed action scenes where it's very obvious that it's being done slow so Holmes and Watson have a chance to get away. Another part, a character gets knocked into the ice water and just sinks down way too quickly. I don't think in real life they would sink that quickly. There's a crash landing at the ending, which should have been a dramatic sequence, but is almost kind of boring the way it's choreographed. I could go on. The action scenes and the choreography and just a lot of the kind of the physical action is not convincing or realistic in this movie. Final verdict, this is probably worth watching. Mildly entertaining, some good 1980s nostalgia, but I think there's a good reason why it never became a classic.